Hello, everyone. Welcome. Very excited to be here in Stockholm. This is I Wish I Learned This Sooner, part 2. Just real quick, this is a lovely turnout. I'm curious how many of you have heard me talk in some capacity before. Just show of hands. That's really cool. Really appreciate that. Thank you for coming to this. I hope this is going to be a useful talk, a worthy sequel to part 1 in Prague last year. We are going to go through as much content as we can in this time, and I want you to have as much information on this if you can. So scan that QR code. There's nothing in there yet, but there will be very soon once we organize all the slides a little better. So if I can't make it through everything in today's presentation, you'll all have access to that afterwards. So let's go through who am I, for anyone who doesn't know, why these particular tips, and then we'll go through all the tips. It's going to be fun. So that's me. Some of you know me as Eyebrews online. Why Eyebrews? Because back in 2008, something like that, I decided that my eyebrows were a very exciting part of me, and that should be what I go by forever. I run Agile Lens, Immersive Design, as well as the Unreal Engine New York City meetup group. That is at meetup.com/Unreal Engine. We also have a nice little online community, and I love teaching, I love organizing, I love educating. What's Agile Lens, by the way? We're kind of a strike team. We're an XR creative studio that comes into very complicated VR projects that need to be super hyper photoreal or super hyper optimized or using crazy experimental platforms, and we make them work. So, that's kind of what we do. We're a very small team, and so I hope a lot of the tips that we're going through today will be useful. They are all tips that me or someone from my company have used and found incredibly useful, and, to use the phrase, made us stop at some point and say, oh, I wish I learned this sooner. So you all hopefully get to learn these things sooner than we did. We're repeating some slides here. OK, and then Unofficial Unreal Engine Podcast, that's a thing. You can listen to it, uepodcast.com. And I've been helping Epic Games out with teaching since 2018. 2020, I became an authorized instructor, and now I have my own authorized training center. Actually, it's the best one in New York. Actually, the only. But, we love to teach. We love to help people out. It's a good time. So first thing I want to jump right into as we dive right in is how do you build a bit of a community? And something I wish I learned sooner, getting right into it, is do some open source projects. Post things to GitHub. We've got a few projects out there at Agile Lens, github.com/Agile Lens. And this was one that got a lot of nice attention because it's Star Wars. A lot of people like Star Wars. And by the way, if you want to do like an open source thing that uses a known IP, typically, check with your lawyers and all that. But the rule is non-commercial, community, fan-made, no profit motive whatsoever. And this has been a way that we've actually built up a nice community and also found some good other contractors to work with as we figure out, how to put together this recreation of the Galactic Star Cruiser experience, which was a crazy immersive theater experience. That's a whole other talk, but yeah, check that out sometime. And, first tip is build a community with cool open source projects. Teaching, also, I just wanted to mention a couple quick tips about when you are helping other people learn how to use Unreal Engine. One is using control key and mouse wheel when you're in like blueprints and everything. That lets you zoom further than you would normally be able to. Also, double-clicking control will show exactly where your mouse is at any given moment. And the widget reflector. This is a nice one for just very easily making everything on your screen bigger. If you're teaching in a way where people have to look at a screen from far away, or you just know anyone might not have perfect eyesight, that's a good way to just make everything bigger on the screen. Also, something we use a lot for teaching is changing the thickness of boxes. This isn't actually just for trigger boxes. This works with anything like post-process volumes and whatnot that often have very thin lines. It helps with visibility. It makes it easier to click on. And speaking of making things easier to click on, don't forget that pressing the T key on the keyboard will actually allow you to click on translucent things like glass and stuff like that. These are going to be a very wide variety of things. And by the way, quick little note, some of these slides I haven't necessarily seen yet because my team's been putting them in all night and we're in different time zones. They're back in New York. So we'll see if I can properly explain some of these things, but there should be some good notes in the deck for you all anyway. One thing we discovered was roughness at any value lower than 1 actually is pretty expensive, even if you make it 0.99. So just be aware of that. If you don't absolutely need something to have some level of reflection, good, quick little way to save some performance cost. Lighting materials, also speaking of things that change if you're at 0.99. Sometimes you get a skybox, HDR, whatever, and you're like, I love this, but maybe the HDRI doesn't have a sun in it, and you want to actually show the sun where it actually is or moving or something like that. If the HDRs opacity, the skybox opacity, is anything less than 1, then you actually get your real sun, your directional light that's in your scene, poking through, which is really handy. We just did a recent daylight study for a project where we were kind of blending between the HDRI light and the directional light, and this was a really simple way to make sure that works. I talked about material parameter collections last year, but that's a great way to dynamically control things, especially via sequencer. Pawn, this is a cool tip from June on my team. The pawn can replicate in 2 different ways. The controller can only replicate in 1 way. And we got a little QR code here. We'll have periodic QR codes if you're like hyper interested in looking more into one particular thing. But when it comes to replication, the pawn can use both the on-server event and the multicast event, but the player controller can only use the on-server event. And replicated actors can only use the multicast event. Keep that in mind if you're doing a multiplayer game. Rep Notify is one that I recently started using, and this might not be best practices. This is just something I got very excited about for my particular workflow. Rep Notify, if you don't know, it looks for when a variable changes, and it creates a function automatically, and it will allow a thing to happen when a variable changes. And I've been doing this in single-player experiences, which is weird because it is a replicated sort of thing, and there are more efficient ways to do that. You can, of course, have set functions and things like that that are also looking for when things change. Obviously, don't do things on event tick if you don't have to, but I just like the fact that this is a very clean way to have a thing happen when a variable changes. For rendering, Stephen Phillips back in Orlando announced this, and I may have gasped out loud, but I want everyone to know about it. You can now, in the movie render queue, render out H.264 MP4 files without dealing with all sorts of FFmpeg, CLI, encoder stuff, and it's lovely. For the longest time, those of us in the legacy movie world could render out these giant, beefy AVI files that were a bit of a mess, and if you just wanted to do like a quick preview of one of your sequences, it was a little bit difficult. And you could enable the Apple ProRes plugin and do an MOV file, but that could also get complicated. Just like a very clean and simple way now, if you just want to do a quick preview of what you've got in your sequencer, render it out H.264 MP4 with whatever kind of compression and quality controls you want. Very nice. Long time coming, too. Similarly, this is older. This actually, I think, came in 5.1, but not enough people know about it. It's so easy now to get movies into Unreal. You put your thing in the movie folder, you take it out of the movie folder, you drop it into your scene, and then it's a movie. For those of us who were using Unreal Engine back in the Unreal Engine 4 days and before, it was like a 20-step process to just get a movie to play in your Unreal Engine scene. So it's just lovely that media plates allow this to be so much simpler now. And if you go and you start to play with the media plate material, you can start to play with chroma keys. This was like a really quick test I was doing, and even stereo and VR. Another thing you might not know is that the material graph gives you access to HLSL, high-level shader language, I think is what that stands for. And so this is like a very, very simple little script that I put together that actually would separate out left and right eye or top and bottom. So if you have a 3D movie or something that you want to make sure is just separating what part of that UV map gets seen, might have other uses besides 3D and VR, it's really handy. File management. When you are building Unreal Engine over and over again, this was me the other day in London, I was like, how is this taking up 420 gigabytes? And so I was trying to think well, there have to be some things that are safe to delete in here. And I'm sure many people knew this before me. This is literally I just figured this out last week. When you're in a project, it's usually pretty safe to delete things like intermediate and saved and derived data cache. And I thought, maybe it's okay to do that for the engine. And again, this is very fresh and I'll just give it a try. I tried deleting intermediate, derived data cache, saved. The intermediate folder turned out to be huge, 172 gigabytes, and nothing bad happened when I deleted it. I'm sure some things had to recompile when I reopened the engine, but for me at least, that was very, very safe. You can delete that .git folder. It's a big folder. There's a lot of stuff in there, but then you're losing your connection to source control, and you'd have to do things again. So if you feel like you're not going to be updating Unreal Engine anytime soon from source or anything from GitHub for that matter, you can delete that Git folder. Just be aware you're losing your connection there. Importing and exporting Visual Studio configurations. This is one from Dante on my team. If you've got a few different setups, different source builds of Unreal, different versions, again, doesn't have to be Unreal Engine, can be anything you're using Visual Studio for. Keep in mind that you can bring in and export and save different configurations. again, seems a bit like a no-duh thing, but like, yeah, I was the kind of person who, whenever I'd be doing source builds, I would kind of be starting from scratch each time and opening up my solution file, and then just kind of hoping everything was set up in a way that was going to work. But as you move from computer to computer and you're working with different people, those things can change. So bring those configurations with you. It will save you time and headaches. Also, speaking of headaches, I started last year's talk with a little bit of a, if you're dealing with C++ and things aren't compiling correctly, like start by just removing C++, and then just try opening the project without any source code and just start there to see if everything opens okay, and then you can add it all back in. This was in that same vein, but a similar sort of thing when recompiling plugins for other versions of Unreal, especially when you're going across platforms to Mac and things like that. I found that sometimes just having the engine version specified caused issues, and that of course can happen when you're doing a source build of Unreal Engine, because that won't show up as like 5.6.0 or whatever. It'll have like a long string of all sorts of other things going on. So these, when you have a plugin or anything, a U project file, et cetera, these are things that are being specified. So in some cases, it's actually safe to delete these. These are meant to be checks, almost like a is valid kind of check sort of thing. But in many cases, deleting these things can actually help things compile if it's expecting something to be there and you aren't quite able to figure out what it wants. And then I just mentioned here, sometimes I've also gone as far as deleting the platform allow list, because again, other platforms, sometimes the platform might not be named what you think it is, and so just by removing that entirely, it's going to compile for more things, or it will try to. So that's been useful for us. When your sequencer ends, I see people all the time, especially when I'm teaching students, who are like, hey, it got to the end of the sequencer, and then it just went back to the way things were. That's the default behavior. On a case-by-case basis, you can right-click on your sequencer track. You can go to Properties. You can change it to Keep State, which would mean when it gets to the end, it stays whatever it is doing. It stays whatever it is doing. Yeah, that's English. At the end of wherever the sequencer ends, Restore State, of course, is what will bring it back to the beginning. But if you want to change that default behavior, you can actually go into Default Engine and change it there. And reminder, of course, that Default Engine is something that you can change at the project level. You can also change it at the engine level. You can go modify certain things in Unreal Engine like that, and then it'll apply to all your projects. Just be careful, of course, especially if you're working on a team and you want to make sure that everyone's settings are matched and aligned. So this is a very specific little tip. I'm going to do these are pretty quick so far, and then we're going to take a break here for a second to be like, here's a little bit more of a deep dive, because this was a really interesting rabbit hole we went down recently for a project where we needed really good-looking destruction on a mobile platform. And we thought, OK, well, geometry caches don't seem to work. And we've started to go down this Alembic rabbit hole. And we have a couple different solutions here. So we mostly just wanted to share this with the world, because we've seen a lot of people run into this issue. And we think we found a pretty good solution. So if you want really good destruction working on, let's just say mobile platforms, doesn't just have to be VR. You can do this. This particular workflow is Blender and Maya. So you simulate physics, do whatever you want over in Blender. You export it all as an Alembic cache file, so an ABC file. Important for all simulated meshes. Apply the scale and set all origins to center of mass. So settings, settings, settings. And then you go into Maya, if you have Maya, and then you can get your whole simulation baked, bring it into Unreal, and then it will work as a skeletal mesh animation, which doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you should be doing for a crazy destruction with thousands of particles. But for whatever reason, that is what has played best and most efficiently for us in a mobile device. Another workflow that was a little bit simpler that I found, that was Dante's workflow. This is mine. Just going directly from Cinema 4D. If you have Cinema 4D, it's a little bit more straightforward. You can go into the Exchange Settings preset, uncheck everything except particles, geometry. If you want to export just selection, it's fine. And then when you bring that all into Unreal, it'll come in as an Alembic cache, and it just kind of works and looks good and runs very efficiently. So cool. I wish I knew that sooner. Live retargeting, another quick little deep dive, because for some of you know that we do these live performances in virtual reality with characters and metahumans, and we deal with all sorts of different performance capture systems. Over the years, we've worked with Xsense and Rococo and Vicon and OptiTrack, and now we're doing stuff with Move and Tracing and Capturing and all that. And so oftentimes we're trying to combine different kinds of mocap data to make something work in a live setting. And there's been a few different ways this has worked over the years. So I wanted to give a quick review of where things are with that right now, now, and also where they're headed. So one of the first things that I needed to figure out was if I've got animation live or pre-cached, pre-rendered animation that needed to work with a metahuman, I needed to find a pretty efficient way to get that to retarget. And I already talked about this last year in my metahuman talk, but just to say it again, you go through here and you can actually make it a child of your, this is the third person character, so your Manny mesh or whatever, and you do these settings, and then it will follow whatever Manny is doing, and that's cool. That's like a live setting that works if you set it up like that. In 5.6, things got a little bit interesting. This is me with my friend here in the speakers lounge the other day, and we started to play with the retarget component, which is new in 5.6. You won't see it in 5.5. And it's a very clean way to connect a metahuman to something else, and it all works live. You don't have to go into the animation graph. You don't have to create a blueprint or anything like that. It just works. Here, I'm just kind of zeroing out exactly how this works as a child of the move and trace and move in 3D guy here. This is a single camera, by the way. It's a markerless mocap system. That's one camera. Pretty cool. We just started playing with it and testing it. And you see as I kind of zero everything out, we've got a pretty good live capture happening here. And the only tricky thing here is we're not getting hand data and we're not getting face data. So face is pretty straightforward. You can use live link face, metahuman animator, that sort of thing. But because we're usually working in VR, we have to have a bit of a different solution because we need our actors to actually be inside virtual reality while they're performing. So just wanted to note for a second that, yeah, again, no animation graph there. It automatically creates or uses this engine level retarget animation instance for the animation blueprint, similar when you're doing live link, live body retargeting, that just becomes a live link animation class. So you don't touch that at all. But if you want to start mixing and matching motion data from different sources, this is our favorite node in the animation graph. It's called layered blend per bone. And what it allows you to do is take different sources. Some of it can be pre-rendered animation like an idle pose that you might want to revert back to if you're missing data. It can be coming from Live Link Face. It can be coming from MetaQuest Pro. So what we do is we take whatever body data we can get from mocap, Move and Trace, and whatever, and then we combine that with face data from something like MetaQuest Pro, hopefully Apple Vision Pro soon as well as the hand data, and then you can end up with a very clever full body solution. And very quickly, so the idea with layered blend per bone is you basically filter out the data that's coming in at different points. So in the top example, this is for making sure that everything with the face is coming from like here up. And then down here, this is making sure that the hand data is coming in as well, because the face and the body, of course, are different animation graphs for the metahuman setup. And then you'll see very briefly here, this was a test we were doing last year, and this one was with this was with mocap and with the Meta Movement SDK, and we just started to compare some different ways to combine this data using that layered blend per bone node. And I'll just kind of skim through it so we don't have to sit here for 2 minutes. But it's the same data coming in at the same time. You can see that we baked it out in sequencer here, just to kind of see what felt like the best combination of different data. So we've got merged here, some of it coming from the Meta Movement SDK, some of it coming from mocap. And then we also started to play with the lovely Mega Mocap VR system as well. So that uses Vive trackers. And it was just a good test as we're like seeing how all this data registers in different ways. We ended up with some interesting rotation offsets that can be corrected. But yeah, the big takeaway here is play with that layered blend per bone node if you want to use different animation data from different sources. Cool. Quick modeling tip, the mesh cut tool, for those of us who remember that joyful moment using 3D applications back in the day where you discover a Boolean operation and you're like, oh, it's so cool, I could cut things out and subtract things and all that. So that's basically what you can do with mesh cut. And especially if you have your snapping on, like grid snapping, it's a very quick way to have very clean, often symmetrical ways to mess with the geometry in your scene. We're finding that because of how robust the modeling tools are getting in Unreal Engine, we have less and less need to go out to our other DCC applications. And that's kind of cool. Reducing meshes in editor. I'm embarrassed. Most members of my team knew this way before me. I didn't know that you could actually reduce the triangles directly inside Unreal Engine without having to like re-import things. It's just right over there when you open up your mesh properties under reduction settings, % triangles. If something starts at 4,000 triangles, you can literally just say, I want it to be 40% of that, and then it comes down to about 1,600. Pretty straightforward, pretty cool, and you can do that on a per LOD level. And then, of course, this will be reflected when you're packaged, but it's non-destructive. So if you're doing this just in editor, you can always go back from 40 back up to 100 if you want to. String versus text versus name. This was an interesting one. Like I just went down this weird rabbit hole one day where I was like, what's the difference between these? And like, when should you use one? And I pretty much have all the information here, but I think you might be surprised to know which of these is the most expensive. And I'll just tell you, it goes from the top down. So text is the most expensive primarily because it is localized. So if you're releasing something that's going to be in a lot of different languages, text is great for that, but it needs to kind of think the hardest about it, so that actually has the highest cost. String is case sensitive, it's mutable text, it may need to be formatted, and name is actually the cheapest, believe it or not. It's not case sensitive, there's no localization, it's really useful for little identifiers, keys, variables, where you need frequent comparisons and you're just checking, does this key equal this key? So keep that in mind. This is, I think, something everyone who is in game design learns probably in their first year. Relatively recent for me, so I had this recent epiphany of like, wait a minute, if I've got a small object in a scene and I want to make it easier for someone to grab that object, what if you just make the collision a little bit bigger? Like it's another one of those kind of duh moments that I'm sure half this room already knew, but it was a nice discovery for me to be like, yeah, of course, just grow that collision box a little bit. And if you're doing a simple collision like a sphere, you don't have to do anything special other than go into the collision settings and you can actually change the, do I have a laser pointer? I do. The radius setting right there to just make it a little bit bigger than the actual object. Handy. In 5.6, I was really happy to see that there's more control now over reflection, refraction. We now have proper ray trace translucency, which hasn't really existed properly in Unreal Engine for a long time, by which I mean that it used to be you couldn't reflect glass in glass. We're dealing with a lot of complicated luxury real estate where everything needs to look absolutely perfect, and for the longest time we couldn't have this glass vase on this glass table because it just looked invisible below. But now with the admittedly expensive ray tracing setting, you can start to mess with that and it looks good. This is also me playing with some different bounce settings. Bounces, of course, are expensive, so always check like at what point does the bounce look good to you, and then don't go higher than that, because very quickly you'll tank your frame rate, especially if you're targeting something like PC VR. And classic question, going back to decades of Unreal Engine use, what do you do when you see lighting needs to be rebuilt? I just wanted to bring this up. It's been covered in other talks, even here at Unreal Fest, but there's a few different approaches. One, of course, is disable all screen messages. And by the way, here's the funny thing, is like, it tells you this right here. But if you're like me, I don't read text that isn't read and loud. So like, I never actually like looked at this for years. And so yes, you can disable all screen messages. That'll make it go away. But for the first 8 years of me learning Unreal, I never actually tried typing in that console command. And it's a good one because it actually tells you these are the things that need to be rebuilt. Because sometimes I'd be like, I have no idea what these 24 objects are. What is the problem? And sometimes it's like there's just a weird glitch. There's something going on where like, for whatever reason, those objects aren't building, and rather than trying to troubleshoot it, like just go and make them movable, or delete them if you don't need them, or refresh them. But it is really handy to be like, these are the particular objects that are throwing that error. And also, if you're in full lumen mode, nanite mode, or you're not casting shadows, you're not going to bake your lighting, don't forget that you can go into your project settings and just disable allow static lighting entirely. Light mixer. This is one of those things that has been in a lot of other applications. I think when I first started using 3ds Max in like 2004, it had this. And so for the longest time, I was like, we need this in Unreal. So I was so happy a couple versions ago when we finally got this. It's a one-stop shop to see all the lighting in your scene. And you can pull out all sorts of different columns with different data. You can edit it in groups. You can create collections. You can set things to be movable if you're doing like a quick test where you're like, what would this look like if instead of baked, everything was like full-on lumen, and compare your frame rates and then change it back. I do want to note, though, that for whatever reason, skylight does not show up in here. So if you've got a skylight in your project and that's going to be affecting the lighting, and maybe that's set to be baked and it shows up as like an unbaked object or something like that, you do want to make sure that you're looking at that in addition to everything here. You also have the environment light mixer. The skylight does show up there. All the mixers are good places to kind of keep track of the atmospheric and lighting and fog and clouds and all that fun stuff going on in your scene. Lights are very cheap if you don't cast shadows. Again, seems obvious, but I think I found myself oftentimes, especially when I first started to build virtual reality in Unreal Engine, thinking like, oh, I can't have too many lights. It's not that you can't have too many lights, it's you can't have too many lights that are casting shadows, especially in real time. Baking it, that pretty much makes it free. Unreal Engine no longer needs to think about it. Of course, stationary lights, even baked or a little more expensive than static lights. But basically, like, if you don't think the shadow is doing a lot for your particular moment in the scene, turn it off. And you see that the difference between not casting the light at all and just not casting shadow is pretty similar in our use cases that we found so far. Also, for those who were like a little bit scared of change when 5.6 introduced the new toolbar up here, it's okay. There is a way to go back. There's a CVAR, tool menu, viewport toolbars 0, and it will revert to the more familiar 5.5 and before version up there. And if you're really feeling nostalgic for like, I miss what UE4 looked like, it's not going to change everything, but there is also here load layout, UE4 classic layout. The primary thing this does is just dock your content browser again, so you're not using control spacebar to bring that up. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways to make Unreal Engine look exactly how you want it to look. This is a weird bit of advice for me to give, but I was never a Mac guy. I only got a Mac because I got an Apple Vision Pro and we started to build stuff with this. And I remember the first time I installed Unreal Engine on it and I found, oh my God, it actually runs really well. If you're using a silicon chip, this has an M2 in it, Lumen, Nanite, all these things work. And the thing that blew me away the most is it compiles really fast. Like, I've got a beefy Puget workstation with, thread rippers galore and an RTX 5090, not that that really helps with compiling, but like when I'm building Unreal Engine source or building a project on this little MacBook, it is oftentimes faster than my giant beefy kind of computer, and it's very quiet. So, Mac isn't paying me anything to say that. I just want people to know that Mac actually works way better with Unreal Engine than I thought, and Xcode runs pretty well. Multiple viewports. I think a lot of people don't know that you are not limited to just the viewport there. Yes, you can divide up your screen and you can have orthographic views and all that. People know about that. Hold down the middle mouse button, drag up and down, blah, blah, blah. Quick way to jump between those. But you can also have multiple viewports. I've seen people with like 5 monitors and they've got Unreal Engine just like the one monitor. And it's like, you can have all these other viewports if you want. Obviously, it's more expensive to render. Turn off real-time rendering. Control R is the shortcut for that if you don't need everything to be updating all the time. But if you need to monitor multiple angles or see things with like different quality settings, or here's an unlit mode, here's a wireframe mode, etc., pull these out, put them wherever you want them to. Similar in that vein to having multiple viewports is you can just pin your cameras. If you've got a camera and you want to keep track of what that particular view is going to look like in your scene, most of us know you click on a camera, you get a preview, but when you click off that camera, the preview goes away unless you hit the little pin there, and it will stay there in your scene. So here for our little Charles Dickens Scrooge production, like we often needed to see what the facial capture was looking like for our wonderful actor Ari Tar, and so just being able to have a direct monitor on that, regardless of what else is happening in the scene, is really handy. Grooms. I love that we got the UEFN metahumans. I love the optimized metahumans. They work great in VR. They work great on mobile. But the way that hair cards, for me, out of the box were looking was kind of funky. So another little rabbit hole I went down was trying to find what settings I could change that would change the look of the hair cards. And I found that these 4 opacity settings here, opacity far, near, pow far, which I think is power far, power near. If you mess with those, you might find that the hair, when you're using hair cards instead of full grooms, is going to look a little better to you. Mess with that to taste. This was a little blueprint I made when I was teaching a class where we had like a bunch of cameras in the scene and people just wanted a very quick way to cycle through them. So, it's a blueprint. It's an editor utility widget that just finds all the cameras in your scene. I thought I'd throw it in here. Why not? Obviously, use Control 1, Control 2, etc. to create bookmarks and jump to different spots in your scene. It's a really handy tool. But this is also useful if you want a quick way to cycle through seeing all your cameras without having to find them in your viewport all the time. Horizon color. This is one of those like really simple things where like once you start to build out your scene, like you probably don't need to mess with this at all. But you might know that unless you have something like exponential height fog in your scene, you end up with this very jarring black horizon off in the distance. So if you see that, get some exponential height fog on. By default, everything will be blue, but it does kind of make you feel like you're floating way up in the sky. And so again, if you're just trying to mask something out really quick and you haven't built landscape or anything like that yet, just note that the fog in-scattering color will change what that kind of ground plane looks like. And sometimes we'll make this kind of gray or whatever our mesh is to kind of match that, so it just feels like that goes out into a distance. The HDRI plugin can also help with this because it can also feel like there's kind of infinite ground going off there. But just a quick little tip there. Converting a level to world partition. Didn't know about this. We thought for a while that if we wanted to do something in world partition that we had to kind of build it up from scratch. Not true. You can have a standard UE4 era level or sub-level, and there is this little button all the way down at the bottom of the toolbar, and you can convert that into world partition, and it's great. Now, be careful, because you'll notice there's nothing that says like convert world partition back to level. However, there is a way around that, kind of, which is that you can copy all the stuff in your Unreal Engine scene and then paste it into a sublevel again. So, some things won't copy over, some of the things that get streamed, like the landscape and all that, but the core geometry of your scene will actually copy pretty nicely back into a sublevel if you are not happy with what's going on in world partition. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I had world partition on, and the easiest way to check that is just see if you go to the levels window and it says world partition is enabled, and of course, if your world partition map shows a thing there. Similarly, too, if you're using world partition, but you need to see more than kind of the default streaming behavior, you can actually just disable enable streaming, which will then keep everything loaded all the time. Like, don't do that with something like the city sample that's huge and is going to crash most computers. But if you've got a reasonably sized, not crazy complex world partition setup, that's a pretty good way to just kind of keep everything loaded so you see everything all the time. Set timer by event node. We've all talked about when to use event tick and when not to use event tick. Just going to have a couple mentions here of like ways to make sure things happen on a certain frequency. So set timer by event. You can do this with math. We know that Unreal Engine has like a calculator thing in there, so you can create fractions or whatever, and it will convert. And then a timer by event can just kind of say like, hey, we're going to do this every 3 seconds or whatever. Way better than having things operating on event tick all the time. I've been using timers for a while. One thing I didn't know, again, I'm just going to keep embarrassing myself with my lack of knowledge. I didn't know that you could stop a timer. So there is a node, a few different nodes that can clear timer or invalidate the timer or clear and invalidate the timer. And it's just a good way to find ways to say like, hey, we don't need to do this for a little while, or we want to stop this completely. And for the longest time, I didn't know that was a thing. Also in that vein of like things you can do besides using event tick for everything is actually multigate. This came from Charles Alexander, who works with us a lot. And we just realized that, yeah, multigate doesn't need to have everything filled out. So if you've got a thing that you want to have happen every 4 frames, or basically every 4 times event tick is fired, as the case may be, like just have some empty pins, and then you can just kind of parse out like, yeah, I want to do this check, or I want to have this thing fire every so many times that, like if you want to keep it as a ratio to other things going on, it's just kind of a cool little trick that I wasn't aware of, and we've actually found some good use cases for it. Child actors. This is another thing that we should have started using sooner. We got into this in a big way recently because we were getting a few headaches with metahumans and realizing that metahumans do not have a parent, that they all share. I think a metahuman's parent is just actor. And so we needed to construct some kind of way to have a shared parent where all the metahumans could be child actors of that. And so it just brought us down the child actor blueprint rabbit hole of like understanding all the functions and components and everything that comes from the top down. So, it's something that I think we all kind of understand. Like when you start in the first person template and there's a first person pawn, you know that that's a child of, a more generic pawn class and all that. But when you start to create these yourselves and you see everything that kind of trickles down into the child blueprints, that's incredibly helpful and useful. And of course, you can override those things as well. You're not bound to just doing what your parents do. You can say, I don't want to do that, Mom, and then have your child blueprints do something else. Just a reminder that there's a lot of really good shortcuts across all of Unreal Engine, but the one that we've started to, think about the most is probably when using blueprints. Hold down B, click, B is for branch, O for do once, et cetera, et cetera. There's tons of these, but just a reminder, they're all super helpful and will speed up your workflow if you know them. Sequencer ones are great too. This is a fun one from Henry Kaiser on our team, who's been doing a lot of cool stuff with MetaSounds. We found out that MetaSounds can actually trigger blueprint events, which is exactly what it sounds like. A MetaSound thing fires, or it makes a sound, or it receives a sound, and then it can make something happen because that sound occurred, which is kind of cool. And I don't think that was really possible with the previous sound system in Unreal. Copying and pasting. in general, let's just back up for a second and say copying and pasting in Unreal is ubiquitous and a lot easier than you think. Like most things in Unreal can be copied and pasted from one part of Unreal to another, from one project to another, if the assets are shared. And there's some different ways to do it. So sometimes you'll see like a more traditional Control-C, Control-V kind of thing. But then down here, of course, if I wanted to like copy this mesh over to something else's mesh slot, you do Shift, right mouse button, Shift, left mouse button. And again, it's a shortcut kind of thing that can speed things up very, very quickly. And sometimes, we're pasting just snippets of things like raw code, which is actually kind of readable. If you just copy and paste all this into something like Blueprint UE or even just a text file, you can kind of see the matrix of how Unreal Engine thinks about most of the assets that move around in there. And then, of course, we started this slide by talking about functions because it took us a while to realize that you could copy a function from one blueprint to another. But if you're going to be doing a lot of that, the next step would just be to use Blueprint function libraries, also covered in my talk last year, but that's just a shared function library everyone in your project can access. Editor optimization, this was a cool one. I think this came from, Dante discovered it, but it was Lars sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that character, who discovered that there is a ton of tooltips that come inside Unreal Engine. So if you're really trying to stream down and reduce the startup of Unreal Engine, you can actually stop all those tooltips from spawning. Speeds things up a bit. Cool. When we're in the editor and you're packaging, this is both the splash screen you see when you're starting up Unreal Engine editor, as well as when you're packaging the project and launching on other platforms. This is something you don't actually need to do directly in the project settings. Unreal Engine will detect if you have a PNG called editor splash or ed splash and splash.png, and it will automatically put those into your project so that they work both for packaging and starting up. Python was something that I came to a little bit late, kind of because I was asked if I would teach a Python class, and I said, sure, and I said, I better go learn Python, and so I did, and it's magical and wonderful. It only works in the editor. It's not something you're going to be able to do at runtime without some very complicated finagling that often crashes Unreal Engine in my experience, but there's some great examples both in Unreal Engine in things like the movie scene plugin, as well as all over the internet. There's so many things you can do with Python, and down my journeys of LLMs and struggling to get them to create good Blueprint, C++ stuff, etc. I'm really excited about the AI assistant in 5.7, by the way, but I find that LLMs are very good at Python, and one of the first things I tried to do with Python in an LLM was like, I need to spawn a bunch of random objects in a scene. I need them to have these physics properties. I need them to interact with each other in this kind of way, and it took like 3 revisions of that to create Python code that I just put into the console down at the bottom. Actually, really quickly, because I did mean to have a little thing to demonstrate this. For those who don't know, you've got your console down here, but you can also just change to Python right there and paste things directly in there. There's all sorts of other ways to bring up Python, but you can literally just paste that code directly into there, and it is incredibly helpful and cool. Fab, yeah, people had some struggles with Fab at the beginning. I think Fab is Fab now. The best thing about it that a lot of people don't know is that if you have the Fab plugin enabled and you click on it there, it is going to spawn not a browser with the internet on Chrome or whatever. It will do this directly inside your project, and you can access all of Fab, and you don't even have to like add things to your library. You can be like, oh, cool, a bunch of animations of people playing hopscotch. I just want to see what that looks like in my project real quick. You can add it directly into your project, say, no, I don't like people playing hopscotch, and you delete it, and it's not there like cluttering up your library. So it's a really quick, efficient workflow. Be careful, though, because this Fab button is different from the Fab button that you'll find up in Tools. So that's the one you want, FYI. For gameplay, just noting, the enhanced input system is great. We use it 90% of the time. But for whatever reason, sometimes for us, it can be a little bit finicky. We'll find that events aren't firing. We think sometimes it has to do with if like one input is referenced in like 2 places, and we haven't seen great logging to identify when that happens. So just as a backup, just until Unreal Engine kills it, we still have the old input system that's been in there since time immemorial, and we do use it sometimes. We'll often just replicate a lot of the same functions we're doing for enhanced input, just so if an enhanced input isn't behaving the way we need it to, we can fall back to the things in the old input system. Just a good backup. Flying character movement, just a really quick way if you're actually using the character class, and you can do this with flying, walking, swimming, whatever, but set movement mode is a really cool node if you just need a really quick way to have a character jump between those nodes. Little drop down for it. It became helpful for debugging some things in our project where ultimately, the character wasn't even going to need this, but it was handy. And then speaking of movement input, I actually talked about this way back in my OpenXR talk at the first Unreal Fest New Orleans, but flying movement, it's not by default in the VR template, but it is something we find that we need quite a bit. And this isn't just for VR. It's just a very easy bit of code for quickly moving through the project. Oh, and I thought I had a blueprint UE thing for here. It'll be in the slides if you access them. But I've got two different versions of the same thing here. So this is no gravity. This is fly basically wherever you want to. It can be based on the controller or the camera or whatever you want. One of these is based on movement input, which does require the floating pawn component as part of your pawn. This one is just add actor world transform, so that can work with just about anything. But just real simple vector-based, like I want to move in this direction and have kind of the same sort of behavior that you would have in the editor as you're navigating around. You want that at runtime. Teleport, for anyone who's, this is mostly VR, but anyone who's dealt with like teleporting from one spot to another, actually it's not mostly VR. Lots of people deal with nav meshes. What am I saying? Even if you don't have a nav mesh set up in your scene, there are often situations where there's a check to make sure that the nav mesh is there and everything's working and everything's simpatico. If you're quickly mocking something up or for whatever reason you don't want a nav mesh, you can actually skip a lot of those checks that say, like, is this a valid location? And then it will still work. The first time I opened up the Electric Dream sample in 5.2 just to test if I could get it to work with VR, I didn't want to have to deal with setting up nav meshes everywhere. So by removing this section, I was able to just teleport basically to anywhere using the VR template that had any kind of collision. So just a quick way to get that working. Now we're into some VR stuff. And actually, we're doing pretty good on time. If you want to see both eyes in VR, there is a console command called VR Spectator Screen Mode. So 0 will be normal, what you normally see. 1 will show a single eye view, and then 2 will actually show both eyes. Really helpful. We talked last year about emulate stereo, which will also give you kind of a dual eye view, but it's really helpful to be able to show someone, hey, when I'm in VR, I'm trying to use megalights. They're working in my left eye, but not in my right eye, and actually being able to show people the difference between the two eyes. All headsets work with 0, 1, 2. Some headsets actually have other options beyond that, where you'll see like different kinds of distortion and cinematic aspect ratios and things like that. So feel free to play with that. Also in VR, I want everyone to know, this was also in my Orlando talk, which hasn't come out yet, so I'm just spreading the word about this, that Victor and the wonderful team working on VR at Epic Games have added OpenXR pass-through, because we now have the OpenXR 1.1 specification, I believe. And so there's just a few lines of code you need to get pass-through to work without any third-party plugin, and it's cool. Just through these 3 lines here. Also, starting in 5.6, for those the 5 of us out there doing Vision Pro stuff, there is now mixed reality mode, so scene pass-through by default, which is great. Before you had to do a source build. Now you can just use a build from the editor. And then in 5.7, this is new. The immersive style can go between the mixed mode and the virtual reality mode without, again, having to do a source build or recompile things. And then there's also options for how much of the limbs you see through pass-through. And then also Vision Pro, because it uses OpenXR, I like people to know that because it's free to do Vision Pro things in Unreal Engine compared to some other platforms out there, if you build something using OpenXR capabilities like hand tracking and gestures, that for one of these headsets, for example, they translate very nicely over to Vision Pro. Sometimes there's some little rotation offsets you need to do, but basically it's going to have all the same functionality from one application to another. So we've been finding that there's quite a few clients we're building a Quest experience for that we can also do a Vision Pro experience for with not too much overhead. Again, Vision Pro's experimental, not production ready, but you can finagle some things to work better than you might expect. This one is very exciting. So reprojection, application space warp, asynchronous space warp, things that make your frame rate better. It used to be that if you wanted to use application space warp, which would give you much better frame rates on mobile standalone devices, you needed to use things like Meta's plugin, or sorry, not Meta's plugin, Meta's fork of Unreal Engine. So quite a bit of overhead here. Now in 5.7, not only do you not need Meta's fork, you don't even need Meta's plugin. It's CVARs right now. It's not something you're going to find in the project settings. But with these, you can actually turn on something that is, I'd say, just as good as what you get when you're using Meta's fork of Unreal Engine. And it works, of course, for other headsets as well. So basically, frame rate, go better now. And then this is getting a little bit into the weeds of some of our workflows, but we just gave like a huge talk at SIGGRAPH about this, so I wanted to have one slide to sum it up. When you have people performing in VR, and this can be a live theater show like we do, or it's cinematics, it's something for a game, whatever the case may be, we found that it's not always super useful to have the actor embodying the character directly. Sometimes it's useful to think of it a little bit more like puppeteering and have them exist outside their character, and that way they have a very clear sense of how what they're doing is responding to the character. Because it might not always be one-to-one, especially if you're not using a full super, expensive performance capture rig. At first, we thought it would be enough to just do like planes, where it's like, yeah, you've got this little monitor and it shows you what you look like. It's way better if you're in virtual reality to see exactly what your avatar looks like, especially to everyone else. And the motion capture comes through very cleanly. For a while, we had all sorts of complicated ways to figure out what version of our experiences were. Yeah, and this is something that, as far as I know right now, is specific to the MetaXR plugin. Doesn't need to be the fork. But if you want a quick way to just be able to have something in your experience that tells you what version code you're on, there is actually a single node that helps with that. For all Unreal Engine projects, you have get build version as a node, but I think that only works with development and an editor and whatnot. It doesn't work in shipping builds, to my knowledge. VR pixel density is dead. Long live pixel density. There's basically a new way that this is described, so just be careful with this if you've used VR.pixel density in the past for these kinds of projects. It's now much more like the way you would do screen percentage. So you'll notice instead of doing something like 1.1 or 1.2 as pixel density was, you'd do 100 for 100%, 120 for 120%. So just a bit of a public service announcement. I started playing with this a little while ago, trying to get better real-time shadows in mobile. I found that if I played with device profiles or even just forced my shadow quality to be higher, in Quest 3 I could get some very nice shadows running totally standalone. And then talking to Victor Broden yesterday, he's like, oh yeah, we do that out of the box now in 5.7, which is great. So if you have a powerful enough headset like a Quest 3, the device profile will detect that, and you'll actually get some very nice shadows with things like stationary lights, and they look good. Tilde key, this is like a weird thing that just has become common practice at our company. If you're playing an Unreal Engine experience and it's in the editor or it's a development build, this won't work with shipping, of course. If we're like not sure if something's frozen, the tilde key, which of course brings up the console, is just kind of like our quick way to find out like if Unreal Engine's actually frozen or something's loading or whatever the case may be. The other thing we'll do often is we'll pull up the task manager and look to see the RAM usage, and if the RAM is too much, too big, then, or sorry, if the RAM isn't moving, if the RAM is static, that's another clue to us that perhaps Unreal Engine is frozen. And then lastly, as we wrap up here, I just wanted to say, hey, if you've got like a complicated Datasmith file that's got a ton of components and objects stuck inside the blueprint and they feel very, I can't seem to access them, I only recently figured out that if you double click on an object, it will actually go into the child and identify exactly what you're trying to use there. So there we go. We actually did all this in time. Cheers.